Emily Harper had only been back in Hollow Creek for a week when she found the pale yellow envelope tucked neatly under the new welcome mat, wedged just so, like someone didn't want it to blow away, but also didn't want to ring the bell. She paused for a second, hands still full of grocery bags, and stared at the envelope. She recognized the embossed seal in the corner, Hollow Creek Neighborhood Standards Committee. The words curved around a sketch of a tree that vaguely resembled an elm, though everyone agreed it looked more like broccoli. Below the seal were the words "Notice of Concern" in faded ink. She sighed, stepped inside with the groceries, and placed the envelope beside her father's coffee cup on the kitchen table. Charles Harper looked up from the Arizona Gazette, folded neatly into quarters. His reading glasses were balanced halfway down his nose, and he wore the same navy flannel he had on when he'd retired 7 years ago, though it had since faded from navy to something more porch blue. He eyed the envelope, then looked back at her. That didn't take long. Want me to guess what it's about, or should I open it? Emily asked, walking back toward the sink to wash her hands. Charles folded the newspaper with the same deliberate care he applied to everything, picked up the envelope, and examined it like a document from a long-forgotten war. Yellow means warning. Not red. That's something. Emily dried her hands, slid into the chair across from him, and peeled the flap open. She read aloud as he poured more coffee. A concern had been raised about non-standard surface treatment and slope modifications to the driveway, potentially affecting the visual integrity of the neighborhood streetscape. The HOA would be recommending a formal review at the next scheduled meeting. She looked up. Visual integrity? Charles didn't reply right away. He took a slow sip, then leaned back. She's making a move early. She? Karen Delaney. HOA chair since 2014, I think. You've met her? Sort of. She walked by yesterday morning. Gave me one of those smiles that doesn't really reach the eyes. That's the one. He turned back to his paper. Keep the letter. We'll need it. The driveway had been poured just days ago, a soft gray composite with a gentle slope leading from the street to the front stoop. ADA compliant, smooth, easy for Charles to use his walker without navigating the 2 steps he used to handle before his hip surgery. Emily had hired the contractor herself, checked city guidelines, and even filed a courtesy notice with the HOA, though no one responded. Later that afternoon, as the Arizona sun stretched long shadows across the lawn, Emily was sweeping up the last of the leaves when she heard footsteps, measured and deliberate. She looked up to find Karen Delaney walking toward her in white slacks and a pale coral blouse, hair set in a precise bob, and a clipboard held to her chest like a shield. "Good afternoon, Emily," she said brightly. "Isn't it just beautiful out today?" Emily lowered the broom. "It is. We're finally getting the good kind of fall." Karen stepped onto the walkway, smiling tightly. "I thought I'd stop by and welcome you properly. I hope everything's going smoothly with your move-in." Emily nodded. "So far, yes. Still getting boxes unpacked, but my dad's enjoying the quiet." Karen's gaze slid toward the driveway. "I couldn't help but notice the new concrete. It certainly stands out." She chuckled softly, then continued, "Of course, we all appreciate accessibility. But the community does have an agreed-upon visual standard, and that slope, it may not align with our long-standing guidelines." Emily straightened. "It meets ADA standards. The incline is within regulation." Karen's smile didn't falter. "I'm sure it is, dear. But the board will have to review it formally. It's not personal. It's about harmony. The neighborhood has a look, and changes like this, well, they can be jarring." There was a long pause. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the dried leaves along the curb. "I read the guidelines," Emily said evenly. "They didn't say anything about gentle inclines for medical accommodation." Karen nodded sympathetically. "The board will decide if that's enough." As she turned to leave, she added, "I'll bring copies of the bylaws to the next meeting. Just so everyone's clear." When she was gone, Emily stood alone on the walkway. Her jaw was tight, her hand still holding the broom handle. Charles was seated on the porch swing, having watched the entire exchange from behind his newspaper. He said nothing, but his eyes followed Karen's retreating form. "That was fast," Emily muttered. He folded the Gazette, laid it on the side table, and reached for his thermos. "She moves quick when there's an audience." Emily sat beside him. The porch creaked softly under their combined weight. Down the block, Myrtle Connors shuffled across her lawn, pulling a small cart with foil-covered tins. She called out, "Emily, I made too much pumpkin bread again. Want some?" Emily smiled. "Sure, thanks." Myrtle reached the porch, passing the container over the railing. "Nice driveway." "She did the same thing with my shutters in '09. Said the yellow was too lemony." Emily opened the foil. "What color were they?" "Eggshell." Myrtle winked. "But I repainted anyway. Sometimes it's easier." Charles let out a quiet chuckle. "Not this time." Emily looked at him. He was holding the HOA letter now, folding it cleanly and sliding it into a folder beside his chair. "Planning something?" she asked. He took another sip. "Just keeping records." As twilight set in, Emily leaned back in her chair and looked out at the smooth, perfect slope of concrete. It caught the last of the light just so. Quiet, deliberate, and steady, just like the man sitting beside her. What she didn't know then was that the driveway wasn't the only thing Karen would try to correct. And the yellow envelope was only the beginning. The community clubhouse smelled like instant coffee, dry erase markers, and polite intimidation. Emily Harper followed her father into the meeting room, trying to ignore the faded poster board on the wall that read "Welcome, neighbors." In curling Comic Sans. The room had the charm of a waiting area at a dentist's office, metal folding chairs arranged in slightly crooked rows, a table with a half-empty box of store-bought cookies, and a water jug sweating into a plastic tray. The ceiling fans spun just fast enough to stir the stale air, but not fast enough to feel useful. Charles moved slowly, tapping his cane once before settling into a seat at the far right. Emily took the chair beside him. In the front of the room sat a collapsible table, behind which the Hollow Creek HOA board members perched like judges in a low-stakes court show. Karen Delaney sat center stage, posture perfect, pen poised. She wore a pastel blazer and a thin gold chain, and she greeted each latecomer with a smile that looked practiced down to the muscle memory. On either side of her sat Todd Brinkley, the HOA treasurer, balding, pleasant, and perpetually nodding, and Linda Morrison, the board secretary, whose expression hovered somewhere between confused and alarmed. A laptop sat in front of her, open to a screen that looked more like an Excel puzzle than a meeting agenda. "Thank you all for coming," Karen began, folding her hands neatly atop her notes. "We have a few items to discuss this afternoon: updates on fall cleanup dates, our upcoming HOA newsletter redesign, and, of course, a community standards concern that has recently been brought to our attention." Emily spotted her name two-thirds down the printed agenda, printed in bold, "Non-compliance review, Harper residence." Her stomach tensed. Charles leaned back slightly and raised a single eyebrow. It said more than words could have. "We'll begin," Karen continued, "with a general reminder that all exterior modifications must be pre-approved by the board, as outlined on page 9 of the architectural guidelines. These rules exist not to stifle creativity, but to preserve the harmony and property values of our beloved Hollow Creek." Emily raised her hand politely. "May I speak to that item?" Karen smiled. "Of course." Emily stood. "My father's driveway was modified to allow easier access for his walker. It was designed to meet ADA requirements. I filed notice with the board, and the work was done professionally. I believe it complies with both municipal code and federal accessibility law." Karen's expression didn't change, but her voice cooled by a degree. "We appreciate your concern, but the board is also tasked with maintaining the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. It's not just about codes, it's about cohesion." Emily tried again. "But the slope isn't visible from the street unless you're looking for it. And it matches the exterior of the original driveway. It's the same shade, desert gray, I believe." Todd squinted at his notes, flipping through a stack of papers. Linda stared at her laptop. I didn't see an application. Maybe it was emailed. Karen spoke smoothly. Let's focus on aesthetics, not legal debates. We're not lawyers here. Charles cleared his throat. Quietly, but deliberately. Karen turned slightly. Yes, Mr. Harper. Has the board completed its annual policy review for this term? He asked, his voice calm, almost casual. There was a pause. Karen blinked. We review guidelines as needed. But the charter requires a policy revalidation each October. Just checking if that happened before this meeting, he replied, sipping his water. Helps to keep track of which rules we're actually following. A beat of silence followed. Todd looked down at his papers. Linda fumbled with the laptop touchpad. Someone in the back coughed. Karen smiled thinly. We'll make a note of that. Now, if there are no further comments, the board will proceed with a vote on whether to issue a formal warning notice for the driveway noncompliance. Todd raised his hand. Just a warning? Yes, Karen said. Standard process. Linda nodded slowly. I second. Karen moved quickly. All in favor? Hands rose, some hesitantly. 5 out of 7. The motion carries, she said. A warning letter will be sent to the Harper residence by Friday. Emily didn't say anything. Neither did Charles. The vote was no surprise. The rest of the meeting blurred past her, updates about a fountain repair, a reminder not to leave trash bins out overnight, a proposed ban on certain colors of solar lights. At one point, someone complimented the new flower bed outside the clubhouse, and Karen beamed as though the praise had been personal. Afterward, as the folding chairs scraped and squeaked across the linoleum and neighbors exchanged quiet goodbyes, Emily leaned toward her father. They really think that driveway's going to start a revolution. Charles reached for one of the cookies from the refreshment table and bit in, contemplative. Not bad. For store-bought. She chuckled, but it was tight in her chest. Are they serious about this? They're bluffing, he said, dusting crumbs off his lap. But they've used this tactic before. You just weren't here to see it. As they stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, Emily glanced back at the clubhouse. A few people lingered inside, chatting quietly. Linda appeared to be asking Todd how to export a PDF. Charles adjusted his cap and walked slowly toward the car. They think we'll get tired and go away, he said. Most people do. Emily opened the passenger door, her expression hardening. We're not most people. Charles gave her the smallest nod. No. We're not. The second envelope wasn't yellow. It was white. Certified. And came with a fine. Emily found it wedged between a grocery coupon pack and the weekly water bill, its thick paper and barcode strip standing out like a challenge. The seal of the Hollow Creek HOA was once again embossed in the top left corner, but this one didn't bother with subtlety. It bore the words Notice of Violation and Fine Assessment, Immediate Response Required. She stared at it for a moment, then carried it inside to the kitchen, where Charles was already at the counter, pouring hot water over grounds in his old French press. The aroma of coffee filled the room. Round 2, he asked, glancing at the envelope in her hand. Emily tore it open and read silently. Her brow tightened. $750, she said finally. For unauthorized structural alteration of the driveway. Charles didn't react. He simply reached into the cabinet, retrieved 2 mugs, and set them down with a quiet clink. They escalated, Emily added. He nodded, stirring sugar into his cup. They always do before the holidays. People are too distracted to push back. She dropped the envelope onto the table and walked to the side drawer, rifling through a pile of printouts. I have the documentation here. ADA slope standards, compliance charts, city permits, everything. I even highlighted the relevant sections. Charles took a seat, pulled the papers toward him, and examined them with the same focus he used to give to quarterly statements. He flipped through, page by page, his fingers moving slowly but precisely. Well organized, he said at last. They're betting on fear, not facts. Outside, the wind rattled a branch against the side window. Emily rubbed her temples. I didn't think they'd go this far over concrete. You gave them something they couldn't control, Charles said quietly. That's usually when people like Karen push the hardest. Just then, a voice called from outside. Emily? You got any of that banana bread left? It was Brian, Karen's teenage grandson, leaning on the gate with a hopeful grin. His hoodie sleeves were half pulled over his hands, and he bounced slightly on his toes like someone used to being cold and bored at the same time. Emily smiled faintly and opened the door. You're lucky. Last piece. He took the wrapped slice with visible relief. You seriously need to open a bakery. Grandma buys these high-protein ones that taste like drywall. Charles chuckled from inside. As Brian bit into the bread, he added, mouth half full, she's been in such a mood lately. Keeps saying she has to fix this driveway thing before the bank finishes something. I dunno. Emily froze. What bank? Brian blinked. Huh? Oh, just something about HOA funding. She said the board needed loan approval for clubhouse repairs or whatever. I didn't pay much attention. He waved and left before Emily could ask more. She turned to her father, who had already stood up and left the kitchen. A moment later, she found him in his study, really more of a den, cluttered with dusty binders, framed certificates, and an old laptop resting beneath a paperweight shaped like a globe. Charles sat at the desk, plugging in a small black USB drive. You kept the records, Emily said softly. I never really stopped working, he replied. Consulting here and there. Mostly for local banks. Old habits die hard. The laptop booted slowly, its screen flickering once before showing a cluttered desktop. Charles clicked through several folders labeled HOA, Hollow Creek, Lending Review. He opened a document titled Loan Evaluation Packet, Hollow Creek HOA. The file date read September 14, 2023. A small yellow icon beside it read Pending. Charles zoomed in on the signature block at the bottom. I reviewed their application 3 weeks ago, he said. Clubhouse roof repairs, lighting, new signage. Nothing urgent, but pricey. The bank needs board-level documentation to release funds. Guess whose name is on the final authorization line? Emily blinked. Wait. You're the one who... Charles smiled slightly. Who signs? Yes. Outside, a wind gust stirred leaves across the yard. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked louder than before. Emily looked at the screen again. They need your signature. Charles leaned back in his chair. And that gives us leverage. Karen Delaney's knock came sharp and early, cutting through the quiet like a metronome set too fast. Charles had been outside since 6, trimming the rosemary bush by the front walkway, his shears clipping with quiet precision. He saw her before she even left the sidewalk, heels clicking smartly against the concrete, folder in hand, expression locked somewhere between cordial and confrontational. Emily watched from the kitchen window as her father stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and turned just as Karen reached the gate. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who expected the conversation to go her way. Good morning, Mr. Harper, she called, voice warm but tight. Is Emily home? She's inside, Charles replied evenly. But I imagine this conversation's meant for both of us. Karen smiled, stepping through the gate without waiting for an invitation. It's just a courtesy visit. We've issued a final notification regarding the driveway. According to Section 4.3 of our HOA guidelines, non-compliant modifications must be corrected within 10 business days from notice, or they're subject to enforced correction at cost. Charles gestured toward the porch. Let's talk on level ground, Mrs. Delaney. May I offer you coffee? Karen hesitated, then shook her head. Thank you, but I won't take up much of your time. They walked together to the porch, where Emily met them with a raised eyebrow and 2 folded newsletters in hand. Karen handed over a slim envelope, white, no stamp, then glanced at the rosemary. Still keeping it neat, I see. Old habits, Charles said. Like printing newsletters with edits that don't appear in the online version. Karen blinked once but didn't reply. Inside, Charles motioned toward the front sitting room, but Karen remained standing. Just to clarify, this isn't personal, she said, looking to Emily now. We enforce the rules consistently across all residences. If everyone started adjusting slope angles or modifying color palettes without review, we'd lose the visual continuity that defines Hollow Creek. Emily stayed quiet, folding her arms. Charles stepped forward. Before we escalate this further, he said in a tone as casual as asking about the weather, you should know that I'm currently reviewing your board's pending loan application with Prescott Community Bank. Karen's head tilted slightly. Loan application? For clubhouse improvements. Lighting, signage, and a new HVAC system. He paused. I'm on the review committee part-time. Just a few files each month. Yours happened to land on my desk. Karen's lips parted, then closed again. That's surprising. Charles nodded. Small world. She shifted on her heels. Of course, any professional connection wouldn't influence. Of course not, Charles said, cutting her off gently. But it does give me context when board leadership makes decisions that seem selective. Karen's eyes narrowed. I'll notify our legal representative to review the loan process. Just to ensure no conflict of interest. You should, Charles said, still smiling. Karen drew in a sharp breath. Have a good day, Mr. Harper. Emily. She turned and left briskly, her footsteps louder now on the walkway. From across the street, Brian stood beside his bike, pretending to fiddle with the chain but clearly watching. When Karen passed, he ducked his head and walked the other way. Emily looked down at the envelope Karen had delivered. Final warning. Says they'll send a contractor to remediate the driveway if we don't act. Charles didn't seem surprised. They won't. Not yet. Inside, Emily spread out the newsletter on the dining table. The printed version included a short blurb about unauthorized changes degrading property value, along with a passive-aggressive reminder about community responsibility. But when she opened the online version on her laptop, the paragraph was missing. She turned the screen toward Charles. Selective printing, he said, glancing up from his chair. That's creative. Emily shook her head. They really think this will scare us. Charles stood and walked to his small office at the end of the hall. A few minutes later, the sound of the old printer chugging to life filled the house. He returned holding a freshly printed sheet of paper and handed it to her. Emily read the title aloud, Request for Special HOA Session, Charter Section 6.4. Charles looked at her, calm but focused. They wanted to make this about appearances. We'll make it about process. Emily stared at the form, then looked up. For the first time, she realized her father wasn't just humoring her fight, he was preparing for one of his own. At the HOA appreciation picnic, the lemonade was warm, the hot dogs were dry, and Karen Delaney wore her pearl necklace like she was chairing the Kentucky Derby instead of a folding table potluck. The community lawn had been strung with mismatched bunting, a speaker on a tripod playing light jazz that cracked every few beats, and a hand-painted sign read, Hollow Creek Together, Thank You, Neighbors. With a few of the letters peeling under the late October sun. Emily Harper arrived with Charles in tow, both armed with a Tupperware of oatmeal cookies and low expectations. They immediately noticed the turnout, maybe 20 residents total, many of whom were already drifting toward the exit with polite excuses about errands and dogs needing walks. Karen stood beneath the community shade tent, smiling brightly and gesturing toward a clipboard on the table beside a bowl of name tags. Let's take a moment to appreciate our shared values, she announced into the mic, which squealed before cutting out. A beautiful community begins with unity. And uniformity. She gestured toward a sign-up sheet labeled Driveway Design Reform Initiative. Charles nudged Emily gently. Nothing says gratitude like standardization. They took 2 paper plates and moved toward the seating area under a cottonwood tree, where Frank and Myrtle Connors were already seated, sipping lemonade from plastic cups and swatting at bees. "Didn't think you'd come," Myrtle said, adjusting her sun hat. "She tried to make me repaint our shed last year. Said the blue was too lively for a utility structure. I told her, it's a shed, not a chapel." Emily laughed. "Did she back off?" "No, but Frank told her the paint was leftover from his Navy days and she couldn't argue patriotism in public." Meanwhile, Karen floated from table to table, her voice high and syrupy. "Just a quick signature," she kept saying. "Purely symbolic, for the good of the neighborhood." Near the dessert table, Brian was crouched down beside one of the folding chairs, trying to retrieve something that had slipped beneath it. Emily watched as he pulled out a single sheet of paper and stared at it for a beat too long. His brow furrowed, and he folded it in half before slipping it into his hoodie pocket. She walked over casually. "Hey, everything okay?" Brian startled slightly. "Yeah, just, someone dropped their shopping list. Looked more like Times New Roman than groceries." He shifted his weight. "It was something about invoices. Contractors. I didn't really read it." Then he walked off quickly, heading toward the drinks table. Emily narrowed her eyes, but let it go for the moment. Back home later that day, she reached into the mailbox and found a small manila envelope without a return address. Inside were several printed emails, some partially highlighted, and a folded spreadsheet. The subject lines were straightforward. Driveway modification proposal. HOA vendor negotiation, margin flexibility. Community maintenance funds allocation, Karen's notes. The spreadsheet listed expense categories, dates, and 2 entries for consulting, driveway compliance outreach, dated the same day as Karen's final letter to the Harpers. The recipient was a company Emily didn't recognize. There was no accompanying board memo or vote noted. She walked inside and handed the packet to Charles, who was seated at his desk with a notepad. "Anonymous," she said. "But seems real." Charles adjusted his glasses and flipped through the pages. "This email," he pointed, references a roundup margin for reclassification. That's corporate speak for padding an invoice. He skimmed the spreadsheet, then tapped the table with his pen. "See here, 2 payments, 1 labeled contractor outreach, 1 legal prep. Same day, no board minutes attached." Emily sat down beside him. "Conflict of interest?" "At minimum. Possibly more." Before she could speak again, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A quiet pause, then a familiar voice. "Emily, it's Todd. Don't ask how I got your number. Just, if you file the motion, I'll support the vote." Click. Emily stared at the phone, then at her father. He didn't look up. "Well," Charles said, "seems the lawn party came with a parting gift." When the official HOA meeting scheduled for October 24th was abruptly postponed due to scheduling conflicts, no one in Hollow Creek seemed particularly surprised. What did surprise people was the neat white sign staked in the Harpers' front yard the very next morning. Frank Connors stood on the sidewalk that afternoon with a plastic folding chair under one arm and a skeptical expression on his face. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his cap. "That's the first time I've seen Charles Harper organize anything louder than a lawnmower." Myrtle gave him a playful elbow. "You're just bitter because he beat you in chess last winter." Inside the Harper living room, the furniture had been pushed against the walls to make space for 2 rows of mismatched chairs, a small folding table with paper handouts, and a whiteboard that Charles had resurrected from the garage. On it, written in his careful block letters, were 3 simple lines. Emily passed around printed forms while Charles poured coffee into sturdy mugs and made quiet conversation with each new arrival. Mr. Singh brought store-bought muffins. Duffy from Willow Bend brought his teenage daughter. Todd arrived late, sat near the back, and said nothing, but stayed. Thanks for coming, Emily began once the seats were mostly filled. As many of you know, the HOA recently escalated enforcement actions against our property due to a driveway modification done for accessibility. But this isn't just about us, it's about how rules are applied, and who gets to decide what community values mean. She passed around a printed page, Section 6.4 of the HOA Charter. This clause allows for a special member meeting to be called if 25% of homeowners sign a petition. We've drafted one for a formal discussion about HOA leadership, procedures, and a proposed pause on non-safety-related enforcement until internal reviews are completed. Charles stepped forward, clearing his throat. Some of you know I still do part-time review work for Prescott Community Bank, he said. The same bank reviewing the HOA's loan request for clubhouse improvements. My name is on that process. That doesn't give me power, but it gives me perspective. And a responsibility to ensure our neighborhood is being managed transparently. He handed out copies of his personal letter, polite, brief, and signed in blue ink. The effect was subtle but powerful. Frank was the first to sign. Myrtle followed without hesitation. Mr. Singh read every word before signing. Others hesitated, fingering the pen, glancing at neighbors, until a gentle nod or word of encouragement tipped them over. Even Brian appeared near the doorway, holding a manila folder under one arm. Printed extra copies, he said, voice low, eyes down. Emily smiled. Thanks. By the end of the gathering, the petition had over 30 signatures, more than 30% of the neighborhood. Enough. Todd lingered as people began to leave. He approached Charles, hands in his jacket pockets. I never liked how she ran things, he muttered. Just, never thought anyone would actually push back. Charles handed him a cookie. Sometimes it only takes one person standing up to remind the others they can, too. Near sundown, the room had emptied, and Emily began stacking chairs. Myrtle returned with a pie tin wrapped in foil. Apple. Still warm, she said, placing it gently on the table. No matter what happens, thank you both, for standing up. Emily blinked, touched. We're not finished yet. Later that evening, Charles walked to the front gate and carefully posted a new sign beside the paper fluttered lightly in the wind as he stepped back and gave it a final look. Behind him, the lights from inside the house glowed through the front windows, and the smell of baked apples drifted through the porch screen. Charles folded his hands behind his back. Let's see how many bring lawn chairs to this one. 2 weeks later, the HOA bulletin board outside the Hollow Creek Clubhouse bore a new laminated notice. New leadership, thank you for your patience. We welcome your voice. It was printed in the same dated serif font as always, but someone had added a border of tiny leaves around the edges. The tape held better this time. Perhaps because the air had turned cooler, or because someone had made sure to press each corner with care. Emily Harper read the notice while walking back from Frank and Myrtle's mailbox. They'd left her a handwritten invitation to Thanksgiving potluck, bring your dad and whatever cookies he likes. We'll handle the rest. The neighborhood felt different now. The kind of different you couldn't quite name until you realized no one was looking over their shoulder. The Harper home had its own changes. Charles had framed the newly updated HOA rules and posted them inside a wooden box by the porch, right where the old, no soliciting, sign had been. Still ugly font, he grumbled, straightening the hinges. But at least they're accurate now. Emily leaned on the post, holding a mug of coffee. You framed them. Symbolic. Besides, he added, beats having to argue with someone about sidewalk widths again. The new HOA newsletter had arrived that morning, shorter, cleaner, and written in plain English. The section titled Leadership Update simply read, Karen Delaney has taken a personal leave from board responsibilities. Interim leadership will be overseen by Todd Brinkley. No drama. No explanations. Just, a page turned. Out front, Brian was painting the side of the Harper's fence with even, careful strokes. He wore headphones but still managed to wave when Emily passed. He's signed up for something called Junior Community Liaisons, Charles said. Asked for a logo. I told him I'd design one if he finishes the fence. Emily grinned. You offered graphic design help? Times change. Over the next few days, Emily received 3 handwritten notes tucked into her mailbox, each from different neighbors. Simple thanks. One included a paperclip with a coupon for pie crusts. Another came with a sketch of a bird and a line, "Your dad speaks softly but with purpose. Just like robins." The new HOA suggestion box, nailed carefully to the side of the clubhouse, had already collected 18 proposals. Some were whimsical, picnic movie nights, others practical, shade-over mailboxes. All were hopeful. Todd dropped by once, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression of semi-permanent overwhelm. I wanted to ask if Charles would consider joining the board, he said. Charles, seated on the porch swing, didn't look up from his book. No, thank you. Todd hesitated. Okay. What about Emily? Maybe as an advisor? Charles glanced over at her. That'd be her call. Emily shrugged. Let's see if the fence gets finished first. That evening, as the last of the sun caught the tops of the pecan trees, Emily and Charles sat outside with a fresh pot of coffee and 2 slices of pumpkin bread from Myrtle. The air smelled of dry leaves and distant cinnamon. A neighbor across the street was already stringing early holiday lights, each bulb flickering against the fading light. Emily looked out over the lawn, quiet for a moment. Think I might actually stay long enough to rake leaves next year. Charles took a slow sip from his mug. They fall the same way every year, but watching them never gets old. She smiled. Neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to.